All right, I'm just going to read his words. So, my buddy had a pretty big mental health issue on Monday, and I couldn't get to him. We served together in Afghanistan. He's my best friend, and he was talking about killing himself. He was locked in a bathroom, and I called the cops and hoped for the best. It gets very sketchy with people like us. He's a registered gun owner, so everybody knew he had access to firearms. I don't know what he had in with him in the bathroom or how they got him out, but it worked. They sent this behavior response team and they coaxed him out and they helped him get help. I saw my friend today. He looks good and healthy. My friend and those BCR team women are heroes. My name is Cherie Remington Cunningham, and I'm the research director at the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I'm the host of today's episode about behavioral crisis response, or BCR, which dispatches unarmed, culturally responsive mental health professionals to respond to behavioral crisis calls. The quote that I just opened with was a story from a veteran living here in Minneapolis whose friend experienced a mental health crisis and was met with a response from BCR. And we're going to dig into that a little bit today. So for years, the city of Minneapolis, along with many cities across the country, has been laying the groundwork to reconsider the role of police in broader community safety. In 2021, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the uprising that followed here in Minneapolis, the city contracted a community-based mental health organization called Canopy Roots to operate a behavioral crisis response team that would be dispatched by 911. The choice of Canopy Roots, a local, majority Black-owned and women-led mental health agency, reflected the community's demand for culturally responsive, trauma-informed care. The service launched with just 2 vans and a handful of responders. In 2023, Canopy Roots asked us at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, or the MNJRC, to evaluate their growing BCR service. And over the next 2 years, we analyzed 11,000 call logs, 500 community survey responses. We conducted dozens of interviews and ride-alongs to really understand both their process and impact. You can dig into those findings on our website, which are linked in the description for the podcast. But here's a couple key things we learned. First, we found that Minneapolis community members' support of BCR is overwhelmingly strong, but not enough people know it exists. There's an awareness gap here for this kind of process and supports. 2, we also found that they're really effective at what they do. BCR is really reimagining crisis response. They're addressing deep and unmet needs in the city, and they're aligning with best practices nationally. And 3, we also heard from the broader safety ecosystem that the BCR is a real welcomed addition to this emergency response service. So police leadership, patrol officers, firefighters, county agencies all wholeheartedly agreed that Canopy Roots is filling a really critical gap here in Minneapolis. So we provide some recommendations in our report urging around continued investment, refinement, expansion, and we're going to talk about some of that today. So I'm excited to introduce our 2 guests that are with us. Each of them bring a unique vantage point in this conversation. So Cherie Hanson is a licensed clinical counselor and supervisor, currently serving as the program manager at both the Minneapolis BCR and the Brooklyn Center Expanded Response Team at Canopy Roots. Cherie's background includes extensive experience supporting high-need students and leading mental health programs and initiatives. Also with us is Tahir Duckett, who serves as the executive director for the Center for Innovations in Community Safety at Georgetown Law. Tahir has a background as a labor organizer, a civil rights attorney, a writer, a nonprofit founder and leader, and namely of Rethink and the Law for Black Lives DC. I'm super excited to be here with you both today. And I'm going to kind of just dig into this sort of definition question. So what actually is BCR? So maybe Cherie, we'll start with you from your perspective on the ground in Minneapolis, and then Tahir, I'll go to you with your scope kind of nationally. I gave a little bit of an intro about it, but what is important for people to know about what BCR actually is for folks who have never heard of it?
So the Minneapolis BCR is unarmed mental health first response operating in the city of Minneapolis. We're focused on providing culturally responsive care and trauma-informed care to the people of Minneapolis. We are all about meeting people where they are, affirming their personal and cultural strengths, as well as community resources and cultural resources. I think it's also really important to note that we are free of charge all
Mm,
ages and operating 24/7 in the city. So we have the opportunity to really meet people where they are in emergency mental health crisis.
awesome. And dispatch by 911, meaning somebody could call 911 and they could get you.
Absolutely. We are embedded into 911. If
Mm,
someone calls and is asking for assistance with someone that sounds like they could be struggling with a mental health disorder or mental health crisis, we are able to go out there as opposed to police or any other organization.
awesome. What about like the national picture? Like, sometimes it's mental health crisis response, but talk to us about sort of like for somebody who is like, what are you talking about? Like, what is that in your world to hear?
Yeah, so I think that it is maybe first and foremost one of the most important legacies of the George Floyd protests.
Mm,
Nationwide, we saw people flow into the streets, and the slogans may have been different. Some people said abolish the police, some people said defund the police, some people were just asking for better. And what we saw cities across the country sort of realizing all around the same time was that this strategy of sending police to do everything under the sun was not working. It wasn't working for police, and it didn't make sense for the people who were on the ground, who needed help and who needed maybe specialized help in ways that, even the most empathetic or well-trained crisis intervention officer still doesn't hold a candle to somebody who does this first and foremost all day, every
mm,
day. And so we see Minneapolis BCR as one of many programs across the nation that really reflect a growing movement of trying to take a broader approach to community safety. One that is not kind of single-mindedly focused on law enforcement or incarceration or use of force, but that is really prioritizing getting people connected to the help they need to solve whatever their crisis may be, and not necessarily seeing every crisis as a crime.
right. If you have a hammer, every
Right,
crisis is a nail. Sure.
right,
Let's talk a little bit about terminology here. So, nationwide, I think we often hear these approaches described as like alternative response programs, or we hear this term alternative response. The assumption there is that it's an alternative to police, right? In the way that we just laid it out. But Cherie, I want to start with you. Canopy explicitly uses this term appropriate response. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, the appropriate response. So, what makes our responders and our team different is that each and every one of our responders are certified, trained, and or licensed as mental health practitioners and or mental health professionals. And what that means is that we are prepared specifically to meet the needs of the community members who are struggling with mental health crisis. Now, we say it's appropriate because our skills and our expertise lines up with the need that
Mm,
exists, as opposed to other first responder organizations that might not be specifically trained in this area. So that's what we see as appropriate response. We are trained to do this work, and we can meet the need in a specific and targeted way.
that's helpful. And do you see other examples of that maybe to hear like nationally, like this idea, I think alternative, sometimes it might like pit, right? Here's one way, here's a different way to do it. And maybe that's an important part of all of this work and practice is showing a different way, an alternative to how we've always done it, or this idea of appropriate response. Like, what are your thoughts on terms in this space?
Yeah, I mean, we could spend probably the rest of the conversation talking about my thoughts on terms in this space. Um, it's really tough because it is a movement that in some ways rose up as a response, right? As a, hey, we don't want this, we
Mm,
want this instead. Police are defined on their own terms, right? They're not defined in relation to fire or EMS, right? And
mm,
same for them, fire and EMS, they're defined on their own terms. This isn't quite yet. whether it's appropriate response, which I think is great, or alternative response, that's all being defined in relationship to somebody
Mm,
else. And so I think I'm hopeful that at some point we'll figure out a name for what we are doing that is that tells the story on its own terms. But I think we also have to recognize that where we're at right now is we're also trying to tell people what we're doing in as short and as quick a way as possible, right? And so that's why I get, why BCR uses appropriate response. They're trying to say we're appropriate for what you need. In some places, they've chosen alternative response because they want to make sure that folks know this is an alternative to
mm,
policing. Other places have said community response, just because they're trying to maybe latch on to this idea of community. In some ways, I think all of them
mm.
work, and I think that they all suffer in some ways from the same sort of downfalls, which is that if you don't know the work, if you're not familiar, maybe it just doesn't quite tell you enough about what it is and not just what it's not.
Yeah, what it is in opposition or alternative or appropriate for. That's really interesting. And I think, they all often around the country, they've got like helpful acronyms, right? CARES and,
Right.
for us, we say BCR,
Heart.
right? Heart. Yeah, right. To sort of
A
like,
lot of people using heart, a lot of people using care. Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. But to your point, I think it's really interesting because I think defining this approach, this service, actually even beyond program's another thing we've grappled with in this evaluation. Like, is it a program? Because like policing isn't a program, it's a service.
Right.
Like it is a thing that should exist. And yet, like, how do
Mm.
we move from, something that people are familiar with and sort of this, defining it in opposition or next to it versus like it is its own thing in its own right. Here's what's happening. Here's our approach or our
Katie, you're
service.
going to have me go rewrite some concept notes. That's a really good point on program because I often talk about them as programs. And that's exactly right. You don't say the fire program, right? That doesn't make any
Right, right,
sense.
right.
Yep.
So I think this is as we start to get actually concrete, like this is the way that it brings this work to life.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear some stories. So maybe I'll start with you to hear because you've got a really broad lens of this work at the Center for Innovations in Community Safety. You folks do like technical assistance, training, and education advocacy work, right? Like you're doing a lot. Can you share a specific example or maybe even like a story of either a city or a jurisdiction or just, something that for you epitomizes like what a successful approach or program to mental health crisis looks like?
Service, Katie, not a
Service.
program. Okay, right. Yes. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is certainly remarkable to me is the stories are myriad, right?
Mm,
Every city that we talk to, every day they are having encounters that are game changing for the people that they are talking to. And that's something that I think is really valuable and indicative of how important it is that jurisdictions start to make this shift. I think one of the ways in which I have also thought about success is the sort of the forward movement, right,
mm,
of these services nationwide, right, that we there's always a danger that, for all of the pilots that we had in 2021 and 2022, that, the first time that crime went up or the
mm,
first time that, we started to see budgets tighten, that these programs were going to be the first to go. These services were going to be first to go, right?
yeah.
That cities were going to say, "Hey, yeah, this was cool, but we're gonna put our money back into what we know." And I think that, in place after place, we've seen a lot of resilience, right?
Mm,
Through mayoral transitions in cities across the country. You know, um, we saw in Durham, for example, the deputy, they've got a city manager model there. The deputy city manager who was overseeing the Durham Heart program actually got promoted to be the city manager, right? And so it was almost a hey, y'all are doing so well. And also, by the way, in keeping with that, now they're expanding the role of Durham Heart
mm,
to take on more homeless services, right? More of the sort of broader continuum of care, which is something that we should talk about, by the way. I don't know if it's on the list, but you know, um, these responders are just responders. They're not necessarily the
right.
fixers of everything, and that's something that I do think is something that a lot of cities have had to weather. Hey, I invested in all of this alternative response, and we still have homeless people. I thought you all were going to fix that, and it's like,
Right.
no, that's not quite how it works. But to get back to your original question, seeing programs, services continue to grow and
Mm,
expand, take on more additional sorts of call types, and continue to thrive even in sort of different political environments, I think is a really, really important story that reflects just how much this actually just makes sense,
mm,
right? That like actually, if we designed it from scratch, it would have looked more like this than it would have
mm.
looked like let's give everything to the police.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. And the sustainability, I think, is something that I would love to talk about more, and I've got some questions on it, but like, the sort of indictment that like through these transitions, they're not going away in ways that we've seen other different kinds of sort of like community or like what people may have perceived as like softer approaches to these challenging problems. They're persisting. Cherie, what about like from your perspective again, like as a program manager, you're and a supervisor, you're receiving calls all the time for supports for these actual like, crises that people are experiencing. Like what example comes to mind? And again, I'm sure you have so many stories, but make this real for people. Like give me an example, kind of like the one I opened with when like BCR responders really made a difference in somebody's life.
Yes, yes. There are so many, and I'm choosing one that kind of stuck with me as maybe something that was emotional to watch and something that felt really powerful to behold. So I often shadow responders, and I was shadowing a team just to kind of evaluate performance and be supportive. And we went on one particular call, and it was to a middle school. A local middle school had called for an emergency response, and there was a seventh grader who
Mm,
was refusing to leave the school after school and had gotten into verbal arguments with staff, kind of going back and forth, had been tearing things off of the wall and whatnot, and very upset, mostly angry that he was showing.
mm,
Um, and it was everyone was there. Police, EMS,
wow.
BCR were all already on the scene or were on the scene when BCR got there. And also there were probably 15 school staff, no joke, just trying to figure out how to deal with this situation. And so one of the things that we recognized right away, the responders that I observed was, you know, seeing what the other people had attempted, how they had attempted to support the young man, and then also um, s- kind of figuring out really quickly, like who's the staff that need to be here and who are the staff
Mhm.
that
I
maybe
love
should go
it.
take a break, and kindly and politely ask, to have the key staff that is the most supportive staff be the one who stayed, which I thought
Mm,
was a wonderful catch on the responders' part. The other piece was to really be where it's only one person talking to him, and even with the team of two responders, one person even stepped back. And
Mm,
so it created this situation where instead of crowding the young person, there was one person trying to relate to him. And you can really see
mm,
that this managing the audience really made a difference, right? And really making that personal connection. And at first, he was not receptive. He was very much like, "Who are you? Behavioral health crisis. I'm not crazy," and all this stuff, right? Which we is totally understandable. He doesn't
right.
know us, and but we rely on building rapport very quickly with them to sort of get our work done and really support them the best we can. And so just asking him about himself and his situation, which I am not sure that that had happened before because immediately
Mm,
he began to say the key issues that drove the situation. I haven't seen my mom for a few days. There's no food at home. I don't have anywhere to go when I leave here because my mom said I can't come back, and she wasn't there yesterday either. So like all of these things where he's beginning to tell us that how his basic needs aren't being met in some way,
mm,
that he's feeling unsafe and he has nowhere to go. And all of a sudden, we see the direct key to the situation. And this young man ended up becoming emotional in a different way. Instead of showing that anger, in he's a seventh grader,
mm,
a young one, right? Which is what makes it
mm,
so emotional. And so he basically, began to be tearful. And it was in that moment that we were able to really support him. The responders were able to support him.
mm,
And eventually we're able out of that to sort of develop a plan of like, okay, instead of being like, focusing on the things that the items that he's tearing off of the walls, right? Which are like pictures, right? Like, art pictures or something, right? And instead of focusing on that and maybe getting into power struggles with him, what ended up happening is that we could make a plan to get his basic needs met, empathize with this young man that was dealing with a situation that no seventh grader really should have to,
mm,
and de-escalated the crisis right then and there, and was able to move him out of the building, to take him to a safe place, which I believe was a family member's.
mm,
So this story always like sticks with me because yes, part of it was mental health, but and also what may have been driving sort of the reactions was indeed those needs that he had, that if we were able to meet them, that was how we could really address the problem. And this young man had had a history of some mental health concerns, and so also the staff were really not sure how to handle that intensity. So
mm,
I was so proud of the responders in that moment and so happy that we were able to provide this appropriate response out of all of the
mhm,
people in the
mhm,
environment, provide this appropriate response for what that young man needed. So,
mhm. Some of the things that you named with that particular example, I'm totally going to go off script here for my questions, but I think it brings up something that you pointed out to here a little bit ago, which is that, crisis response is, responding in a moment, right? Like firefighters are putting out the fire, and we don't necessarily expect firefighters to like show back up next week and rebuild the house, right? So
right.
like how do we think about and maybe I'll just go right back to you, Cherie, like in your experience, like especially with a young person like that, and we're talking about basic needs, that those needs aren't going to go away per se, right? Like there are some resources and supports you can connect that person with, but how do you see crisis response as connected to meeting needs of community members, in
Yes.
Minneapolis? And then I'll go to you to hear for that one too.
So there are um, needs that exist in the community, and many times crises actually are developing and growing out of the lack of some other need that is existing. And an example would be we oftentimes find that hunger,
Mm,
or like needing food or shelter, right? Or benefits or consistent mental health support, and sort of the breakdown in the community's ability to provide these things to individuals gives rise to a crisis oftentimes. And we could say it's a situational crisis, but it really can be mental health. If you think about the
Mm,
stress and the pressure and the experience associated with living in poverty or experiencing a violent or crime-ridden community, that and the experiences that come along with that. These things oftentimes do create mental health vulnerabilities in people that sometimes it just takes one or two things to happen before people are really going over the edge, if that makes sense. And
mhm.
so we really see that it's kind of a and you'll see this if you shadowed our responders. We often do offer water or snacks or some basic needs, sometimes at the beginning of our interaction, as a foot in the door to continue that interaction, but also to sort of take those basic needs and what's associated with those basic needs being unmet, kind of take care of that so we can then begin to take care of their mental health. And so they're just really interconnected. There's almost no way to pull apart crisis response from the crises that people are already experiencing in the community that are situational and associated with their lives.
Mm, mm. And I wonder to hear, like, as you think about this, you know, maybe this is a provocative question, but like in the same way where maybe we thought police could do everything that might be related to crime or disorder, like what risk do we run with behavioral crisis saying like, well, these are so, these crises in the moment are so connected to all of society's, faults or these unmet needs that people are experiencing. So like now that we've got BCR, like you said, homelessness should be addressed, right? Like where are you seeing that tension?
Yeah. Let me respond with an analogy that is a limited analogy in some ways that I definitely want to make sure that I come back to. Um, but I think that this is potentially helpful. So I think that EMS is a really good way to think of the analogy here. And actually, up until the 1960s, if you had a heart attack or if you got into a car accident, the emergency response that you could expect was dramatically different from what you'd
Mm,
expect today. Emergency medical services at the time could have been provided by police. They might have been provided by hospitals, fire departments, volunteer groups, even undertakers. Um, there was no standardization for emergency response training really until the Freedom House Ambulance Service was launched by
mm,
civil rights organizers in Pittsburgh in 1967 because they were saying it doesn't make sense for police to come into our neighborhoods and provide emergency medical services. So maybe you see
mm,
where my analogy is
mhm,
is
mhm.
is going. Now, if you think about emergency medical services without a hospital to take people to, or without a long-term cardiologist that you could see, right? So let's take the heart attack example, right? You can go to a emergency room if you're having a heart attack, and they'll stabilize you, but they'll take you somewhere else in the hospital to make sure that you get longer term treatment. And you'll probably be seeing a cardiologist and a primary care physician for much of the rest of your life. And if you didn't have any of those things, then yeah, you might be right back in the ambulance a couple months later, a couple of weeks later. And
Mm,
so we do need to think about the rest of our sort of crisis continuum, both in terms of mental health, but also all of the other co-occurring things that might be happening that might be contributing to somebody's mental health crisis. In the same way that we need to think about the broader medical system in the United States. And in some ways, in the same way that we already think about the criminal legal system, right?
mm,
I'll always remember when Moki Macias, who runs Atlanta's Policing Alternatives and Diversion Program, their alternative response program, she said, how effective would people think that police are if they didn't have the jail,
fails.
right?
Mm, mhm,
And so, we have to really be thinking. I think that alternative response, community response, appropriate response, absolutely critical right? You need a first responder. You need somebody who will show up and will help to stabilize, but it is only part of the story. And if we don't get the rest of the story right, then we're going to look around and really feel like, somebody who called an ambulance for somebody and there wasn't a hospital to take them to.
Right, right, right. This is such a great segue to the thing, perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm very excited to talk about, which is research in this space. So, one of the things that was really cool and in some ways maybe unexpected about our evaluation and our work with Canopy Roots is that as we were digging into call data, we were trying to explore sort of clinical presentation and like what are we seeing in terms of like the kinds of services that Canopy is providing. But what we also found was in some ways that data was like a needs assessment for the city, right? Like we were able to say, gosh, this really shows us a pretty powerful picture of the kinds of potential needs, or what we called in our report drivers for these calls, right? Like if you dug into individual calls and each call had a narrative, you might say, well, the clinical presentation was agitation or whatever, but the driver was potential, like hunger, or was like unstable housing, or family and like relationship issues. Like this is really growing out of something that's that is relational in nature, and like that's the need there. And so I got really excited, and again, we just looked at a year's worth of data, but I was like, the city could you really think about how to use behavioral crisis response data as let's figure out where we need to provide more services. And that was just sort of like one idea, but I'm curious, and maybe I'll go to you first, Cherie, for this one. But like there is obviously, of course, like value and importance of research in this space, but how do you down on the ground, how do you think about the value of like research and data for better doing your job and understanding BCR?
Yes. So one of the things that is very important, has always been important to Canopy since the very beginning, is that excellence in therapeutic services. And so really knowing how much impact in terms of like how quality people feel the interventions are in the service is when we come out to meet them where they are. And just really being able to have our responders well trained, and prepared to meet a variety of situations, and have that clinical understanding needed to provide a high quality response. So that's what I really love about it. That's how I use it a lot, like thinking, okay, where could we fill in gaps with training to make sure we have information about this or that, right? But what I think I appreciated about particularly this research and the report that you all created was, um, we it allowed us to see maybe like barriers in the community that existed, where it doesn't matter how amazing our responders are or how well trained they are, but if people don't know about the service, right, then it's that excellence maybe doesn't matter as
Mm,
much, right? And so I think it was those perspectives that were uncovered by the research that were really eye-opening for me, and it challenges me to think beyond just a very much like clinical, perspective, and more into like what's the big picture of this work in the city, and
mm,
how do we make that impact that we want to make, beyond how, skilled we are clinically or not, right? So that's why I appreciated
right.
it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think that it's hard to think of that big picture when you're doing the work every day.
Yes.
And that is the value, I think, sometimes of having the opportunity to do research. To hear from your vantage point, I think the CICS has an alternative response research collective, right? So you've got a clear space where you're thinking about research and the value of research. Talk to me about what you've learned and the importance of research in this space.
Yeah, a few things. And one, that I think is maybe starts with some of what you just said, about some of what you were finding, once you actually had a chance to dig into the data, which I think for what it's worth is exactly why Durham made the decision that they did to start bringing a lot of kind of homeless services into the community safety department there because they were the ones who were seeing stuff, right? It's like that was the main became very quickly the main touch point for the city of Durham and people who are in kind of a variety of different kinds of crisis. And so I think that like those kinds of uses are really important. They're also really important because they get beyond this sort of first swing of evaluations, which were often just really focused on, does this work or does it not work?
Right.
Right. And I think that we're quickly coming to a place, if we're not already there, and I kind of think that we're already there, where those kinds of evaluations are going to be less and less interesting, right? There's kind of enough out there for us to be able to know that these kinds of programs can be effective. And I am more interested now in ways in which we can drive additional sort of efficacy, right? What are
Mm,
the additional kinds of call types that, maybe these programs aren't necessarily going to or aren't providing services for that, might could fit underneath their umbrella. And so those are things that I think are potentially much more interesting. And then the last thing that I would say, and I think this is absolutely critical and really requires some movement from, I think, cities and municipalities, which is that if you want programs to be able to demonstrate their efficacy and to be data driven, you've got to fund that.
mm.
And folks don't want to do that, right? Let me put more boots on the ground. Let me put more boots on the ground. Great. Are you going to fund not just the evaluation itself or not just the data infrastructure, the data personnel, but also the time it takes from programs to be able to participate
Right.
in these kinds of evaluations, right? None of that
Right.
time is free. And I just think that policymakers, when they are thinking and
Mm,
asking for, data-driven approaches, all right, great. Invest in the data, invest in the
mm,
personnel, invest in the infrastructure, and invest in the program personnel to be able to absorb the additional asks that come from that.
You know what's so wild is our evaluation came as an ask from Canopy Roots, the organization that like they asked for it. And it's remarkable because I don't think that happens very often. Like usually sort of it's an external directive. We need to see what works, give us your evidence base, right? But leadership at Canopy came to us and said, we're building this plane, we're flying it, and we know it matters to figure out what are our key mechanisms? How do people experience us? Like one of the things Cherie mentioned that I thought was really powerful from our evaluation was we spent some time in community and with ecosystem partners interviewing law enforcement to try to say like there might be some narratives around whether or not law enforcement like or don't like or alternative response. That's an empirical question for me. Let's ask, let's figure it out, right? Like lo and behold, in the city of Minneapolis, I can tell you almost to a person, we heard from folks in the ecosystem around safety that like we love PCR. Oh my gosh, please don't ever get rid of PCR. Please fund it. We need more of them. Like they're taking the kind of calls and they're trained to deal with these situations, everything from a seventh grader who's got these like deep unmet needs and doesn't have a place to go safely to somebody who is a veteran who fought in Afghanistan who is like unstable, like and the whole spectrum, like folks at Canopy are prepared and trained to respond to. And so if there is, just to put a finer point for all of our politicians listening to this podcast, if there is if there is consistency, it's around the need for this. And so we have to commit to funding it. We have to figure out how to put our money where our mouth is. which is a great transition. And of course, we are running out of time. But I do want to ask just kind of a last question about this. Like, where do we go next? Like, what are, I mean, funding is so important, so obvious, so so universal in some ways, that we all need to like resource these things that work. But maybe aside from or in addition to funding, like what are the big potential barriers to sort of expansion or sustainability that you should see here locally, Cherie, that folks on the ground listening to us could tap in and support? And then Tahir, I'll kick it to you sort of nationally.
Yeah. I know we already said funding, but it's a little more specific than that. It
Yep.
really I think to hear you really touched on it earlier, having the funding to um, have personnel, hire personnel that can really develop some of these finer points, right? And from like, yeah, having a data, someone who handles data within the organization, someone that handles training, and where it's not just like the program manager and program supervisors who are also trying to run operations, handling and trying to develop training, whereas there's just not
Mm,
enough time in the day. So I want to say
mm,
funding, but really for those particular pieces, right? To how to really make um, the service more effective, generally speaking, and also studying the service. We're really lacking maybe the ability to fund those types of positions. I also think that a barrier to expansion is just perhaps a lack of understanding of what we do and
mm,
not getting that message out that this exists in the
mm,
community. As you know, that was one of the points that were found in the research. And so just figuring out how do we do that without having a bunch of funding, right?
mm,
How do
mm-hmm.
we make sure that the service is known about so people call us and request us? How do we make sure that we aren't being pulled onto calls that maybe are out of our scope, but particularly compromise the core of what we are, right?
Mm,
Where we're hiring therapists and mental health practitioners who are, asked to give rides to places, as if we were a taxi service, right? So really having that precision and being allowed to do the work to meet the high need that already exists. I think those are some of the barriers that I see.
right. That's so helpful. And thinking about that structure piece that obviously requires resource, but also requires a commitment to infrastructure to be able to build
Yes,
something like that.
infrastructure.
What about nationwide? Similarities, differences? What are kind of the big barriers to making this stick, to making it become, like a firefighter was, or EMS? It's so fascinating to hear your history of EMS. I didn't know that history
Yeah.
myself. And so, what a great metaphor.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I love about it is just how recent it actually is, right? I think we often think of, oh, 911. 911 doesn't even exist until the late 1960s, right? So this idea of like, I think we think of it as something that's been around forever. And, it's the reality of it is that our emergency response system is kind of constantly evolving. And I think this is
Mm,
just a next sort of natural evolution. Um, I love this question, in part because it allows me to plug a white paper that we are going to be releasing on sustainability in the next few weeks. That
awesome.
is informed by our sort of joint project with nine alternative response programs across the nation that you mentioned earlier that we're calling the ARC. And that paper, I can tell you, it obviously talks a lot about funding and about various sorts of funding mechanisms. But it does really talk about cities and municipalities getting used to spending local dollars on these kinds of
Mm,
projects, right? We don't
mm,
we don't fund police just through private philanthropic grants.
mm,
We recognize it as one of the key services that our cities are responsible for providing. police, public schools, EMS, fire, right? These are all things that we say, hey, we've got to make sure that we fund these things. And I
Right.
think one of the arguments is for cities to start thinking about this work in that sort of bucket. But we also talk about creating the sort of infrastructure at the state and national level that can contribute to the growth of the field, right?
Mm,
We should be thinking about state level, um, state level departments that can help to, ensure that programs like these are able to get off the ground in more cities that can, start to warehouse state expectations for what this work should look like. We should be looking at national offices and departments, whether it's SAMHSA or whether it's other kinds of programs within the executive branch that are really focused on driving the field forward. We need to be thinking about national associations
mm,
for not only alternative response workers, but for, program leaders. We need leadership development institutions for program leadership. We need to really focus on the workforce and the pathways so that people don't come into this work, do it for 3 years, and then just have to go find a job somewhere else, but that they can continue to grow and develop and remain in the field so that we get the benefit of folks who, you know, have been doing this work for 10, 15, 20 years who can tell us, hey, this works, this doesn't. Here's a good place to experiment. Here's something that we still haven't figured out. Right. I mean, we would be, I think we'd all be pretty panicked if we had to rely on, police officers who had only been out of the academy for 3 years to be like our next generation of program leaders, or I'm sorry, our next generation of police chiefs, right? Those are folks who have
right.
been policing for 2 decades and now they get to become
Yeah.
a chief. And so we want those same kinds of pathways, I
Mm.
think, for these programs.
Yeah,
So,
workforce development is huge, and that was a big takeaway from our work with Canopy was their sort of attention to, supervision, but also support, well-being, benefits, like all of those things that matter deeply
mhm.
if you want to build lifelong or at least like long enough careers where you can carry that wisdom, as you mentioned. So much more to dig into, but I'm going to end it with our final question that we ask everybody on this podcast. And it's our magic wand question. So maybe just like in a sentence or two, you've got a magic wand. What would you change about our criminal legal system? What one thing would you tackle with that magic wand? Cherie, I'll turn to you first.
Well, I mean, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, when you're a mental health worker, right? When you're a therapist, you really recognize the importance of just providing really good mental health support to people who are involved in the criminal legal system. I think the numbers are astronomical. I don't know where they're sitting right now, but I maybe around 60% or something of people who are in the jails at any given point in time have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder at some
Mhm.
point. And those numbers alone just tell us that it's something that like just mental health is important all throughout the criminal legal system. So,
Great. Amen. Super small plug for our work around pretrial. There's a lot of really amazing work around pretrial support services, right? Recognizing like what are the supports that people need in that pretrial moment to actually then, like, lo and behold, prevent crime when you can provide somebody with stability. Awesome. All right. More mental health care in our criminal legal system. We can get on board with that. What about you, to hear your magic wand? Where are you going first?
Yeah, my magic wand, it's gonna be, and this is I've spent much of this conversation with my professor hat on, so this one's gonna kind of gonna stay in that same sort of bucket. Um, is that we replace our sort of carceral logic approach
Mm,
to the criminal legal system with an approach that is anchored in prevention first,
mm,
right? So I almost just said prevention first, right? But I want to make clear there are ways in which we can do prevention that are still rooted in the same carceral logics that got us mass
mm,
incarceration in the first place, right? And there is a risk, by the way, in only using kind of social work or mental health care as a salve if we don't also pair that approach with um, an approach that is really rooted in consent and autonomy and and not coercion, right?
mm,
There is a, I mean, we did deinstitutionalization for a reason, right?
mm.
And, I don't want us to think about going back towards that sort of model. And I think there is a danger of that, right? And we've
Yeah.
seen politicians talking in ways, we've seen this presidential administration, if I'm quite honestly, talking
Mm,
in ways that are really, really focusing on, involuntary holds as the solution to every problem, right?
mm,
So I do want us to think really, really deeply about prevention first, but also prevention that gets rid of that carceral logic.
it really brings us full circle back to one of the first things that came out of our evaluation with Canopy Roots, which was these guiding values and this focus on human dignity and autonomy is like core to the work that
Hmm.
Cherie and her team do, core to it, which is like I think in some ways for folks like me who are not in this space all the time is kind of remarkable, right? Like you're responding to a crisis, you're trying to de-escalate, and but like the story you told us about the seventh grader, like you've got to figure out, like you've got to let this person lead. At the same time, you have to listen, understand their dignity as a person, as a human being, and start there to support them and in building prevention. So much goodness. I need a couple of magic wands to hand you both, so that we can get to work with our wizardry. But in the meantime, we're going to have to wrap it up there. So I'm so grateful for you both taking the time to talk with us today. We'll put lots of resources in the show notes for the podcast. So that white paper, when it comes out, hit us up with that for sure. We'll send it out to folks, and our evaluation and some awesome videos and other resources, so people can learn more. But I just want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of Transformation Blueprint. Here at the JRC, we believe in the power of possibility and transformation. So join us next time as we continue building that blueprint for a more just Minnesota. In the meantime, please rate and share this episode. Check out the resources, visit our website at mnjrc.org, and follow us on socials. Most importantly, stay engaged, stay curious, and remember that transformation starts with you.